a millionaire hiding from the world, chased by flashing cameras and relentless headlines. Marcus Kane thought he could buy silence, but peace never came, until one stormy night, he slipped into a forgotten bookstore. There, Clarke Reyes, a poor girl stacking worn-out novels, noticed his trembling hands. She didn't recognize his name, his wealth, or his scandals. She only saw a man in need of kindness. Her offer of tea and a quiet corner would unravel secrets of the past, ignite an unexpected bond, and change the course of both their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The rain fell in sheets across Ellswood's midnight streets, blurring the neon lights into streaks of color. Outside the luxury hotel, cameras flashed like lightning. Shouts pierced the storm. "Marcus, over here. Is it true? Who was the woman?" The crowd surged forward, umbrellas clashing, lenses raised. Marcus Kane pulled the hood of his coat lower and pushed through the chaos, chest tightening. He had lived in the spotlight for years, but tonight it felt like drowning. His driver had lost him in the confusion. The bodyguards scattered, trying to hold back the paparazzi. And Marcus, CEO, Millionaire, the man who once owned every room he walked into, was suddenly just another shadow on the wet sidewalk, sprinting nowhere. His lungs burned, not from the running, but from the weight pressing against his ribs. Then, at the corner of Ashfield Street, he saw it. A bookstore. Small, unlit except for the faint golden glow from within. A relic among glass towers. He pushed the door open, and the bell above rang with a sound so fragile it made him pause. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust. Wooden shelves loomed like sentinels. The storm's roar muffled, replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, letting the sound of rain fade. For the first time that night, no one was shouting his name. "Sorry, we're closed," a soft voice said from behind a stack of books. He turned. A young woman stood on a small stool, sliding paperbacks onto a high shelf. She wore a faded sweater, sleeves tugged over her hands, her hair falling in dark waves as she worked. She looked ordinary, tired, perhaps, but steady. Her eyes flicked to him, then lingered a second too long, as if noticing something off. Marcus's voice caught. He hadn't spoken without calculation in so long. The words felt foreign. "I just needed a place to sit." The girl tilted her head, curiosity softening into quiet understanding. She climbed down from the stool and set the books aside. "You look like you've been running from a storm." Her tone wasn't accusing, just observant. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Marcus almost laughed. He pressed a hand to his chest, shaking his head. "Something like that." She nodded toward the back. "There's a chair near the window. I was just making tea. You can sit until the rain slows down." Tea. The word hit him strangely, like a note from a forgotten song. He should have refused, explained that he didn't drink tea made by strangers, that he couldn't stay here, that every minute outside his apartment was a risk. But his legs carried him forward anyway. The chair she pointed to was worn but comfortable, tucked beside a small round table stacked with novels. Marcus lowered himself into it, exhaling slowly. His coat dripped rain onto the floorboards, leaving dark stains. The girl disappeared behind a curtain and returned moments later with 2 steaming mugs. She set one in front of him without ceremony. "It's chamomile. Nothing fancy." He looked at the cup, the steam curling upward. For years, every drink he'd touched had been poured from crystal glasses, handed to him by waiters with perfect posture. This mug was chipped. The tea was simple, yet his throat tightened as if it were the rarest gift. "Thank you," he murmured. She gave a small smile, then sat across from him, pulling her own knees up onto the chair. She didn't ask his name. She didn't search his face like everyone else did, trying to find the man from magazine covers. Instead, she sipped her tea and studied the rain-streaked glass. Silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Marcus realized he couldn't remember the last time he had sat like this, with no agenda, no deal to close, no cameras to face, just breathing in the scent of old books and chamomile. Finally, the girl spoke. "You don't have to tell me what you're running from, but sometimes hiding in the right place feels like starting over." He studied her face, the quiet strength in her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 28, yet she spoke as if she'd carried burdens heavier than her frame suggested. For the first time in years, Marcus wanted to answer honestly. But before he could, a flash lit the window. Cameras, voices outside, muffled but unmistakable. His chest clenched. They had found him. Clarke Reyes set down her mug and glanced at him. Her expression didn't change, but her voice dropped to a whisper. "Follow me." She stood quickly, motioning toward the back shelves. Marcus hesitated only a second before rising. She led him between tall bookcases, pulling him into a narrow aisle stacked with boxes. The storm raged outside, and the voices grew louder. Clarke met his eyes, steady and calm. "If you stay very still, they'll think no one's here. This place has survived worse than rain and gossip." And for the first time that night, Marcus believed her. The storm outside rumbled like an angry beast, pressing against the thin windows of the bookstore. Flashbulbs flared through the glass once, then faded as voices shuffled past. For a long moment, only the sound of rain dripping from Marcus's coat broke the silence. Clarke stood steady, her gaze fixed toward the door, until the last echo of footsteps disappeared. "You can breathe now," she whispered, letting out a small exhale herself. Marcus hadn't realized he was holding his breath. He unclenched his fists, flexing stiff fingers. His whole life had been about control. Yet here he was, hiding in a corner like a fugitive, guided by a girl who didn't even know his name. "Thank you," he said, voice low, rougher than intended. She tilted her head. "You don't have to thank me. It looked like you needed somewhere to vanish." Her words struck deeper than they should. Vanish. That was exactly what he wanted, what he had wanted for months, maybe years. But Marcus Kane never vanished. He was hunted, photographed, sold in headlines. His face belonged to the world, whether he wanted it or not. Clarke brushed dust from one of the boxes, sat down cross-legged on the floor, and motioned for him to join. He hesitated. Sitting on a dusty floor was something Marcus Kane did not do. Yet he lowered himself anyway, coat wrinkling, knees bending stiffly. For a moment, they were two strangers tucked away in a forgotten aisle, with nothing but shelves of words around them. "Why this place?" he asked finally, gesturing to the shelves. She ran her fingers along the spine of an old leather-bound book. "Because it's quiet, and because books never ask for anything back. They just wait until you're ready to read them." Her answer was so simple it almost hurt. In his world, everything came with a price. A smile, a deal, even a friendship. But here was a girl who spoke of silence as if it were treasure. "You work here?" he asked. "Most nights." She gave a small shrug. "Daytimes too, when the owner can't make it. And sometimes at the cafe across the street. And when my sister's school bills pile up, I pick up shifts cleaning apartments." She smirked faintly, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "So basically, yes, I work everywhere." Marcus felt an unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not pity, something sharper. Shame, maybe. He had spent millions on lawyers to clean up scandals that barely touched him. while she scraped coins together for rent. "And you?" she asked, eyes flicking to him. "What do you do?" The question nearly made him laugh. Everyone knew what he did or thought they did. Headlines screamed it daily. CEO, investor, tycoon. But none of those words felt real anymore. He swallowed, choosing carefully. "I used to build things. Companies, mostly. Now, I just try to survive them." She studied him for a moment, then nodded as if she understood more than he said. "That sounds heavy." "It is." The words slipped out before he could stop them. His mask cracked further. Clarke leaned back against the shelf, her sweater slipping off one shoulder. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't polished. But there was a steadiness in her presence that unnerved him. "You look like someone who hasn't rested in years," she said softly. Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, but the truth pressed too close. He hadn't slept through the night since his mother's death. He hadn't eaten without cameras clicking in months. And he hadn't been seen, really seen, in longer than he could remember. Something inside him trembled. He turned away, staring at the titles stacked high. The Lost World, Broken Dreams, The Silent Sea. Words that mirrored his own reflection. "You're right," he admitted finally. "I don't remember the last time I rested." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. Clarke's expression softened, and she reached for another book, holding it out to him. "Then maybe tonight you start small," she said. "You don't have to fix everything at once. Just rest for a chapter." Marcus took the book, the worn cover warm from her hand. He didn't open it, but he held it like something fragile. A lump rose in his throat. He had boardrooms of people who feared him and crowds who hunted him. But this girl, with second-hand clothes and tired eyes, was the only one who had offered him rest. The bell above the door jingled suddenly. Clarke stiffened, setting her mug down. Voices murmured at the front, low but insistent. Marcus's blood chilled. They had come back. Clarke didn't panic. She pressed a finger to her lips and rose silently, her movements practiced, like someone who had learned to live unseen. She whispered, "Stay here." Before he could protest, she walked toward the sound, shoulders squared. He watched as her figure disappeared between shelves. His heart hammered, not from fear of the press, but from something stranger, the fear of her facing them alone. He gripped the book tighter. Somewhere beyond the aisle, he heard her calm voice greeting the intruders. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Marcus Kane prayed she wouldn't let them find him. The bookstore felt smaller when the voices reached the back aisles. Clarke's steady tone carried across the shelves. Calm, polite, but firm. Marcus strained to hear, every muscle taut. "Sorry, we're closed," she said. "You'll have to come back tomorrow." A man's voice answered, slick with persistence. "We saw someone come in. Tall guy, dark coat. Was it him?" Marcus's pulse thundered. He pressed himself against the shelf, the worn book still clutched in his hand like a shield. Clarke didn't falter. "The only person here is me. And unless you're planning to buy something, I need you to leave. Now." There was a pause, footsteps shuffling. Then another voice, female this time, sharp with skepticism. "You'd tell us if Kane was here. You know what kind of money we'd pay for a tip." Marcus's throat constricted. He could almost picture the exchange. Clarke's tired sweater against their designer coats, her quiet determination against their greed. But then came her reply, low and cutting. "Some things aren't for sale, especially not people." The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but not from fear this time. Her words were a barricade, not just for him but for what he represented. Someone who had been bought and sold in headlines until he forgot he was human. Finally, He heard the bell above the door jingle again. Footsteps retreated into the storm. The press had left. Clarke returned moments later, her shoulders still squared, but her hands trembling just slightly as she tucked them into her sleeves. She caught his gaze and offered a faint smile. "They're gone. For now." Marcus rose slowly, setting the book back onto the box. He didn't know how to thank her. Words felt small compared to what she had just done. "You didn't have to protect me," he said quietly. Her brow furrowed, as if the idea surprised her. "Of course I did. You looked like you needed it." He let out a rough laugh, though there was no humor in it. "People usually protect me because they're paid to, or because they want something in return." Clarke studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "That's sad." The simplicity of her statement hit harder than any accusation. Marcus turned toward the rain-slicked window, shame curling inside him. He wasn't used to vulnerability, but with her it seeped out in cracks he couldn't control. "You don't know who I am." "No," she said, voice steady. "But I know what I see." "And what's that?" Her answer came without hesitation. "A man who's tired. A man who doesn't trust silence because he's forgotten how to rest in it. A man who thinks he's invisible, even when the whole world is watching." Marcus blinked, stunned. No one had ever described him that way, not investors, not colleagues, not so-called friends. He had been called powerful, ruthless, brilliant, impossible, but never human. For a moment, he forgot the cameras, the headlines, even his own name. There was just Clarke, her eyes reflecting the storm's dim glow, and the truth hanging between them. He swallowed hard. "Why would you care?" She shrugged, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. "Because I know what it feels like, to be unseen, to want to disappear." The words settled over him like a weight, and then, strangely, like release. Marcus lowered himself back into the chair, running a hand over his face. He had never admitted weakness to anyone. Yet here, in a dusty bookstore with a stranger who stacked paperbacks for a living, his walls began to crack. "What about you?" he asked, voice softer now. "Why disappear?" Clarke hesitated, then sank into the chair across from him again. She wrapped both hands around her mug, even though the tea had gone cold. "Because sometimes the world takes more than it gives. And when you don't have much to start with, disappearing feels like the safest choice." Her honesty cut deeper than any headline. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, searching her face. She wasn't playing a role. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply telling the truth. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost: trust. The storm outside raged on, relentless. But inside, between two strangers from worlds that should never have touched, something fragile began to take root. Something neither of them expected. The rain softened into a steady drizzle, the storm's rage fading into whispers against the glass. The bookstore felt like an island now, suspended outside of time, cut off from the city's noise. Marcus sat with his hands clasped, staring at the chipped mug Clarke had given him, though he hadn't touched the tea again. His chest rose and fell slowly, as though preparing for words he didn't want to release. Clarke sat opposite him, her posture easy but her gaze attentive. She hadn't pressed him. She hadn't asked for details or headlines or explanations. She simply waited, as though she knew silence could be more persuasive than questions. Finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was lower than before, weighted with something he rarely let out. "Do you know what it feels like to be photographed more than you're spoken to?" Clarke blinked, then shook her head softly. "To have every movement dissected, every word twisted, until you start doubting if you even exist outside of what they print?" He let out a bitter breath, eyes dropping. "I built empires, Clarke. companies, charities, foundations. But the one thing I could never build was quiet. Her brows knit gently. That sounds lonely. He gave a rough laugh, short and humorless. Lonely doesn't cover it. I buried myself in work after my mother died. She was the only person who kept me grounded. And when she was gone, I thought if I just worked harder, earned more, I could fill the silence. The words felt jagged leaving his throat. He hadn't spoken of his mother in years. The grief had calcified, locked away beneath steel and numbers. Now, in a dusty bookstore, the lock cracked open. Clarke's hand tightened around her mug, her eyes soft. And did it work? No, his jaw clenched. It left me surrounded by people who wanted what I could give them. Investors, politicians, even. His throat caught and he swallowed hard. Even the woman I thought I'd spend my life with. The name burned on his tongue, but he refused to speak it. The betrayal was still too raw. He saw Clarke watching, not with pity, but with something else, something steadier. It gave him the courage to continue. She left me the same night the papers ran a story about our engagement, Marcus said flatly. Said she couldn't breathe in my shadow. Said my life was a prison. The irony is, his lips twisted bitterly. She was right. It is a prison, but it's mine. And no one has ever tried to open the door. For a moment, silence thickened. Marcus expected judgment. He expected a polite nod, maybe the flicker of recognition as she pieced together who he was. But Clarke didn't move. She simply studied him with a quiet intensity that made his chest ache. Then she whispered, "You're not a prison. You're just lost." The words pierced him. Simple, unadorned, but they carried more weight than the hundreds of speeches he had endured in boardrooms. Marcus stared at her, stunned. No one spoke to him like that. Not with gentleness. Not with clarity stripped of motives. He should have pushed back, laughed it off, built the wall higher. Instead, his throat tightened, and he looked away, blinking against a sting in his eyes he refused to name. Clarke leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees. "Do you want to know a secret?" He glanced back at her. She offered a faint, almost playful smile. "Sometimes I pretend the books here are people. Safer people. They don't leave. They don't betray. They just stay waiting for you to open them. My sister thinks it's silly, but," she shrugged, "it helps." Marcus found himself smiling faintly, despite the ache in his chest. "Your sister?" Clarke nodded. "She's 15. Smarter than me, though she doesn't believe it. She wants to be a doctor, but money makes dreams complicated. So I keep stacking shelves and pouring coffee. Someone has to keep the lights on." Her words struck him differently, like a mirror held up to his own life, but stripped of wealth. He buried himself in companies. She buried herself in shifts, both chasing survival, both sacrificing pieces of themselves. Marcus let out a long breath. "I wish I had known someone like you years ago." Clarke tilted her head, her smile gentler now. "Maybe you weren't ready to listen years ago." The truth of it hit him square in the chest. For the first time in longer than he could measure, Marcus felt his defenses lowering. He wasn't Marcus Kane, millionaire, tonight. He wasn't a headline or a target or a ghost of ambition. He was simply a man in a bookstore, speaking to a woman who had no reason to protect him, yet did. And in that fragile quiet, Marcus wondered if this was what peace had always looked like. Not in wealth, not in silence bought with money, but in being seen, really seen, by someone who expected nothing in return. The rain outside slowed further, as if the storm itself had chosen to rest. The night deepened, the rain softening into mist. The bookstore was nearly swallowed by silence, broken only by the ticking of an old wall clock. Marcus sat back in his chair, shoulders no longer drawn tight as wires. For the first time in years he felt lighter. Vulnerability had poured from him in fragments, and Clarke had not recoiled, had not judged. But peace never lasted in his world. The bell above the door jingled suddenly, sharp against the hush. Marcus froze, breath catching. Clarke turned, her expression shifting instantly from calm to alert. Two figures stepped inside, journalists, their cameras already half raised. Rain dripped from their jackets, pooling on the floor. One scanned the shelves, eyes narrowed, while the other called out with a voice that echoed through the quiet. "Mr. Kane? We know you're here." Marcus's chest clenched. He had nowhere to run this time, no shadows deep enough. But before panic could take hold, Clarke placed a steady hand on his arm. "Stay still," she whispered, eyes locked on his. "Let me handle it." He wanted to argue, to warn her what kind of people she was up against. But her gaze was unwavering, and for reasons he didn't understand, he trusted her. Clarke rose, smoothing her sweater as though she were preparing for an ordinary customer. She walked toward the intruders, her steps measured. "Can I help you?" she asked evenly. The man with the camera raised it higher. "We're looking for Marcus Kane. He came in here." Clarke tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Marcus Kane? The billionaire?" She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "You really think someone like him would end up here? This bookstore barely makes enough to pay the electricity bill." The second journalist frowned. "We saw him." "You saw a shadow," Clarke corrected, moving deliberately between them and the back of the store. "People run past here all the time when it rains. Unless you're here to buy Wuthering Heights or a crossword puzzle, you're wasting my time." The woman narrowed her eyes, stepping closer. "Funny. You look nervous. Maybe because you're hiding him." Clarke's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She bent down, picked up a stack of unsorted books, and set them firmly on the counter. "I look nervous because two strangers with cameras barged into my shop after closing. If you don't leave, I'll call the police, and I'll make sure to mention you tried to bribe me earlier tonight." The man stiffened, color rising in his cheeks. The woman cursed under her breath. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, reluctantly, they turned back toward the door. "This isn't over," the woman muttered. The bell jingled as they stormed back into the misty street. Silence rushed in behind them, thick and heavy. Clarke leaned against the counter, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. She closed her eyes for a beat, inhaling deeply. Then she turned back toward the aisle. Marcus was standing halfway between the shelves, his expression unreadable. Relief and awe tangled across his face. "You..." His voice cracked and he started again. "You didn't just protect me. You fought for me." Clarke shrugged, trying to downplay the heat rising in her cheeks. "They were bullies. I don't like bullies." Marcus stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her as though she were the first solid ground he'd found in years. "You don't understand. People don't do that for me. Not without a contract. Not without an angle." She held his gaze, steady and calm. "Maybe you've been looking in the wrong places." The words landed like a stone in his chest, rippling outward. He realized, with startling clarity, that this dusty bookstore and this woman with tired eyes and chipped mugs had given him more safety than all his money ever had. For a long moment, neither moved. The rain whispered against the windows, the clock ticked, and in the quiet, something fragile but undeniable grew between them. Marcus had entered the shop to escape the world. But now, for the first time, he feared leaving, because the world outside felt unbearable compared to the warmth he had found here. The storm had passed, By the time dawn's first pale light filtered through the bookstore windows, Ellswood was quiet again, its streets glistening with last night's rain. The shop smelled of damp paper and brewed tea, heavy with the silence that followed intensity. Clarke stacked the last of the unsorted books back into their places, humming faintly under her breath. Marcus watched from the chair, eyes tracing the way her hair caught the early sunlight, strands glowing like bronze. Something unfamiliar stirred in him, a peace he hadn't felt in years. But peace had a way of shattering when he least expected it. Clarke reached into one of the cardboard boxes near the counter, pulling out a ledger too heavy for its worn spine. She frowned, brushing dust away. The cover bore a faded embossed name, Eleanor Kane Memorial Library. Her lips parted slightly. She turned the cover, scanning the handwritten notes inside, donations, dates, book titles cataloged decades ago. Then she looked up, startled. "Kane," she whispered. "This place, it belonged to your family, didn't it?" Marcus stiffened. His gaze snapped to the ledger, then to her. His throat closed. Clarke stepped closer, holding out the book. "I didn't know. Why didn't you tell me?" A storm rose in his chest, fiercer than the one outside hours ago. "Because it doesn't matter," he said sharply, rising to his feet. "Of course it matters," Clarke pressed. "This shop isn't just random. You came here because it was hers, your mother's." The word cut like glass. He snatched the ledger from her hands, slamming it shut. "Don't say that." Clarke flinched but didn't back away. "Marcus, you think you understand?" His voice broke with anger, though beneath it pulsed raw pain. "You think because you stack books here you have the right to dig into my past? This place was her dream, and He choked, his chest heaving. "I let it rot, just like I let her memory rot under the weight of my failures." The confession burst out like a wound reopening. Clarke stared at him, eyes wide with compassion, but he couldn't bear it. Compassion felt like pity, and pity felt unbearable. "You shouldn't have touched it," he said, voice lower now, trembling. "You shouldn't have touched any of this." Her brows drew together, pain flickering across her features. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought." "You thought wrong," he snapped. The silence that followed was brutal. Clarke's hands tightened at her sides. For a moment, she looked as though she might reach for him anyway, might step closer despite the storm raging inside him. But then her shoulders straightened. "You asked why I cared," she said softly. "I cared because I saw a man worth saving. But maybe you're too determined to stay lost." The words struck him harder than her silence ever could. Before he could respond, Clarke slipped her sweater tighter around her frame and turned away. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped into the pale morning, leaving Marcus standing in the ruins of his past, the ledger trembling in his hands. The bookstore felt colder without her, its silence no longer soothing but suffocating. He pressed a hand to the cover of the ledger, his mother's name beneath his palm, and realized for the first time in years, he had pushed away the only person who had seen him, and it was his own doing. The bookstore was silent long after Clarke left, but for Marcus, silence no longer meant peace. Pressed on him like a weight, crushing, merciless. He paced between the shelves, the ledger clutched in his hands. Every word in it, every note his mother had once written, burned his chest like fire. Eleanor Kane Memorial Library, her legacy, her dream, and he had turned away from it, just as he had pushed Clarke away minutes ago. By the time the morning sun climbed higher, Marcus stood at the window, staring at the street where she had disappeared. His reflection stared back at him. A man in an expensive coat, eyes hollow, surrounded by wealth yet emptier than he had ever been. For once, he didn't want to be Marcus Kane, the name on every headline. He wanted to be the man Clarke had seen, the tired, lost figure who might still be saved. And he knew he couldn't let her walk away. Clarke sat on a bench across from the bookstore, sweater pulled tightly around her as the morning chill crept in. She should have gone home hours ago, should have been sleeping before her cafe shift. But her legs refused to move. Her chest ached with the echo of his voice. Sharp, wounded, defensive. She had tried. She had reached for him, and he had slammed the door shut. But even now, she couldn't stop thinking of the look in his eyes when he spoke of his mother. Beneath the anger, there had been something fragile, something broken. And despite everything, she still cared. The sound of footsteps made her glance up. Marcus stood there, breathless, his coat half-buttoned, his hair damp from the drizzle. He looked nothing like the photographs that painted him as untouchable. He looked human. "Clarke," he said, voice unsteady. She hesitated, her hands tightening on the edge of the bench. "You shouldn't be here. The press." "I don't care about the press." He took a step closer. His voice trembled, but not from anger this time. "I care about you." Her breath caught. She shook her head, pain flaring. "You pushed me away. You made me feel like I didn't belong." "I know." His throat tightened. "I've spent my life pushing people away before they could leave me first. But you," he swallowed hard, eyes locking on hers. "You're the first person who's ever stood by me without asking for anything. And I was too afraid to accept it." Clarke searched his face, waiting for the polished mask, the rehearsed lines of a man used to negotiations. But there were none, only rawness. "I don't need your money, Marcus," she said quietly. "I'm not offering money," he replied. "I'm offering me. Not the CEO, not the headlines, just the man who walked into your bookstore last night, lost and tired, and found someone who made him feel alive again." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why should I believe you?" He reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger. His hands trembled as he held it out. "Because this is hers. And for the first time, I don't want to run from it. I want to honor it. With you." Clarke stared at the ledger, then at him. Her chest ached with a mixture of fear and hope. Slowly, she rose from the bench. "You really think you can change?" she asked softly. He nodded, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Not alone, but maybe with someone who reminds me I'm still human." The silence stretched, heavy with possibility. Then Clarke reached out, her hand brushing his. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the traffic, the city, even the lingering storm. Her fingers tightened around his. "Then don't make me regret this," she whispered. A breath shuddered out of him, relief flooding his features. Marcus pulled her into a quiet embrace, the ledger pressed between them, a symbol of past and future colliding. Across the street, the bookstore waited, golden light spilling through its windows. For Marcus, it was no longer a hiding place, it was a beginning. And for Clarke, it was proof that sometimes the smallest kindness, a cup of tea, a quiet corner, could change the course of two lives forever. The city stirred awake around them. But in that moment, Marcus Kane and Clarke Reyes stood still, bound not by money or headlines, but by something rarer, the courage to choose each other.